Surprisingly, over 90% of viewers haven't subscribed yet. If you're enjoying the content, hit that subscribe button. It motivates us to keep creating and helps us never miss an upload. I used to measure our life by Saturday pancakes. If the skillet hissed and the butter smelled like the start of summer, we were fine. If the batter sat cold in the bowl while we stared at our phones, something had shifted. By last fall, the kitchen went quiet every weekend. No jokes, no flour on the counter, just two people moving around each other like passengers heading to separate gates. At first, I blamed workload. Madison had taken on a bigger role at the design firm, and I was traveling for client reviews. Schedules scraped against each other. We left notes instead of speaking, sent texts from the next room, and laughed at shows we watched alone. But the silence at night didn't feel like exhaustion. It felt like a closed door with the lock on the other side. She rolled away. I learned the ceilings in our house by heart. After a month of polite distance, I tried to talk. I made tea, cleaned the living room, even folded the laundry the way she liked, shirts halved, then thirds. "Are we okay?" I asked. "Just tired," she said, weightless voice, eyes fixed on a catalog. "Work's been heavy." "Then let's be light," I said with a smile that barely held. She squeezed my hand, set it down, and promised a weekend getaway later. Later never came. I kept a brave face, because that's what you do when you love someone. You choose patience and tell yourself everyone hits rough water. The trouble is, rough water isn't the same as turning the boat around. The clues didn't arrive like thunder. They came in whispers. Madison changed her lock screen. She turned the shower on before stepping in, like she needed the spray to erase a minute of something else. She started running after work and came home already showered, even though the route ended near our street. The first time I saw the orange bottle of vitamins in her tote, I thought nothing of it. The fifth time I read the label, prenatal. I'll admit my chest went tight. I stood in the pantry holding that bottle while the dishwasher hummed. My name on the prescription? No. Hers. A refill date from last week. I put it back exactly as I found it and forced my breathing to calm. Maybe a doctor had recommended folate for general health. Maybe she'd told a friend she wanted to start a family someday and someone had made a suggestion. Maybe didn't last. She left a planner in the car with notes in neat, careful handwriting. Ovulation window, underlined. No dairy. Hydrate. The kind of organized plan Madison always brought to work, now applied to a future she hadn't mentioned to the person supposed to share it. I stared at those words and felt something inside me. Something naive and hopeful. Step back to a place where it couldn't be heard again. I decided right then that I wouldn't accuse her, I wouldn't plead, I would pay attention. Attention has a way of turning regular days into crisp photographs. I noticed the way she checked messages with a half smile she didn't show at home. I noticed a silver key on her ring that didn't fit any door we owned. I noticed the way she flinched, tiny, when I hugged her from behind, then said, Sorry, I'm just jumpy lately." The long runs ended near a small set of offices by the river, architects, a print shop, a craft brewery. She once joked about a coworker whose boyfriend brewed IPAs there. The joke wasn't funny anymore. I told myself to be steady. I cooked. I planted bulbs in the front bed because spring always, eventually, keeps its promise. When she stayed late, I sent a photo of the backyard maple turning red. When she came home early, I put down my phone and made sure my eyes met hers. She still didn't meet mine for long. 2 weeks later, she slid into the kitchen with a brightness that wasn't ours and set her phone face down, a habit she'd never had. "We should talk about, starting a family," she said in a tone rehearsed in a car mirror. "Now?" I kept my voice neutral and sipped water to buy a second. "What? Changed?" "Just thinking about the future," she said. "I'm 32. You've always been great with our nieces." She touched my forearm. "I think we'd be good parents." "We." The word felt like a borrowed jacket that didn't belong in our closet. I nodded slowly. "I'd love that, if we're solid." I looked at her like a man on a porch in a storm, hoping she'd step under the eave with him. "We haven't been close." She smiled a careful smile. "Then let's fix it. And, not wait forever." That night she went to bed early with what she called a headache. I stood at the sink and stared at the dark house reflected in the window pane. Our street lamp painted a circle on the lawn. Leaves rattled. A neighbor's dog barked 2 streets over, the way the world reminds you you're not special, just another household lit from inside. I thought about the vitamins. I thought about the planner. I thought about the key. A man can ignore a lot when he's in love, but he shouldn't ignore a pattern that spells out his own erasure. Every revenge story people trade online is loud. Smashed phones, shouted names, spray-painted driveways. That's not my style. I wasn't out to win a war. I wanted the truth, the whole of it, with paperwork and timestamps, so I could take my life back with the kind of calm that hurts more than any shout. I started with a simple step. I booked a checkup with my doctor and asked for a fertility panel under the pretext of planning. The doctor, a practical woman who had known me since college days, ordered the tests. "You're healthy," she said a week later. "But remember, conception can take months even for couples in a good place." "Of course," I said. "Good place." The phrase followed me home like a tune you can't shake. We weren't in a good place. We were in a waiting room. Next, I followed the runs, but with respect. No tailing at night, no confrontation in a parking lot. I simply timed my own jog to pass the office row near the river. From the trail, you can see across the lot through glass storefronts. The brewery glowed warm with Edison bulbs. The print shop's lights went out by 7. On 2 evenings, I watched Madison exit a side door behind the architect's space and walk to a black SUV I'd never seen before. A tall figure hugged her, clean, quick, and she climbed in. The SUV pulled out with the ease of practice. Names matter when you're collecting proof. I remembered a co-worker she mentioned months ago, a project liaison named Connor who loved hiking. I went home and looked at the firm's team page. Connor smiled in a headshot with the exact height suggested by that parking lot silhouette. He wore a field jacket in a staff picnic photo. I closed the laptop. I stood in the dark office and told myself not to decide anything based on pixels. Evidence often sits in overlooked places. Our bank statements, for instance, showed sudden charges at a boutique baby store 3 towns over, items purchased under curbside pickup, which could have been gifts. Our shared calendar contained a recent block labeled Strategy, typed with the same capital S she used for salon. When I clicked, the location showed as a park by the river. I copied nothing and took nothing. I wrote dates and times on a notepad I kept in my desk drawer under an old baseball glove. Alongside those notes, I wrote questions only she could answer. When did we stop being partners? Why did you leave and stay at the same time? If you wanted a baby, why didn't you want it with me? Planning doesn't erase pain, it just gives it a direction. I didn't sleep much. I started waking before dawn and making coffee. Madison no longer drank because she'd switched to herbal tea for wellness. One morning, while she showered, I noticed her gym bag open. Inside sat a folded receipt and a tiny ultrasound photo. No name printed on it, just grayscale ripples and a date that made me sit on the bathroom rug. 6 weeks. My hands didn't shake. They simply learned the shape of a line I didn't know I had, one that separates what you can forgive from what you cannot be asked to pretend. If you're expecting the flare-up, the big scene, you won't find it here. I didn't confront her right then. I kissed her cheek when she left for work, went to my own office and booked an appointment with a family attorney recommended by a friend who'd been through a quiet separation. I asked about property, about fairness, about walking away with dignity. The attorney listened, drew boxes and arrows on legal pad. If there's a child, she said gently, you'll want to be precise about facts. Facts, I repeated. The word steadied me like a handrail. I didn't want to punish. I wanted a life built on something that couldn't be shaken by a secret. The plan grew in practical steps. I arranged, through a lab that processes routine medical tests, to preserve the results from my recent checkup, including the fertility panel that indicated a very low probability for conception without targeted treatment. I updated our home insurance. I called a realtor to inquire, casually, about market value. I put my baseball cards in a safer box. I stayed kind. I didn't pick fights. I let the days line up like dominoes. Every story needs an invitation to its final act. Mine arrived on a Tuesday. Madison texted me a photo of a reservation confirmation at a quiet Italian place we loved when we were new to the city. Dinner, she wrote, confetti emoji. I stared at the screen for a long minute. That restaurant had the best corner booth in town, tucked behind a half wall of ivy. People proposed there. People said apologies there. People also chose that booth when they wanted to share news they could control from the first syllable. Perfect, I replied. I'll be there. All afternoon I felt the strange calm of a man who has memorized his lines. I left work early, stopped by a small office where a notary verified signatures on documents I hoped I might never need, and drove to the restaurant with a folder in my briefcase. The city glowed in late light. A band practiced in a garage. Somebody parallel parked on the third try and threw both hands up in victory. Ordinary life continued, a kindness that surprised me. Madison was already seated when I arrived, cheeks pink, hair tucked behind one ear. She wore the red top she loved because it made her feel brave. She took my hand with a warmth I hadn't felt from her in months. "I'm glad you're here," she said, and for a flicker it felt like the world might reverse itself. We ordered, made small talk about a neighbor's new puppy, and laughed, really laughed, when the waiter cracked a joke about my indecision over pasta. Then her smile changed. It didn't dim. It grew careful, like a person about to unwrap a glass ornament. She reached into her purse, eyes shining, and placed a tiny envelope between us. "I have a surprise," she said, voice trembling in a way that told me she'd practiced a steadier version. "I wanted to tell you somewhere special." I looked at the envelope without touching it. I let the quiet settle, the clink of plates, the muted music, the hum of a date at the next table. I met her eyes and gave her the kindness of not making her say it twice. "Congratulations, honey," I said softly, the way a man does when he can acknowledge joy without endorsing the story behind it. She blinked, startled by how easily the word landed. Then I reached into my briefcase, took out the folder I'd prepared with a care I used to save for anniversaries and vacation plans, and set it on the table, just to the left of her envelope. Her breath caught. Her hand paused inches from the paper. It wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. The color drained from her face so slowly, it felt like watching a tide go out, leaving wet sand and footprints that could no longer be ignored. Her fingers hovered above the folder as if it were aflame. She didn't open it right away. She didn't have to. The embossed seal on the top. Page was enough to tell her this wasn't flowers or a love letter. Her lips parted, then pressed closed. For the first time in months, I watched Madison's confidence drain away. "You knew," she whispered. Not a question. An admission. I didn't raise my voice. That would have been too easy, too messy. Instead, I took a sip of water, let the clink of the glass against the table fill the silence, and nodded once. I knew. Inside that folder were facts, not anger. Copies of medical reports showing I hadn't been intimate with her for months. A fertility panel from my doctor, highlighting numbers that made it impossible for me to be the father. Receipts she'd left behind without realizing. Dates that overlapped with her late-night strategy meetings. I hadn't written insults or circled anything in red. Just neat, printed records in the order they told the truth. The restaurant faded into a blur around us. Other couples murmuring over pasta, the clatter of silverware, the warm glow of candles. In that booth, it was only us and the weight of paper. Her hand trembled as she finally lifted the top page. Her eyes scanned the medical report, then darted to my face. I held her gaze steady, no anger, no smirk, just a calm she couldn't manipulate. "Please, it's not," she began. I leaned forward just slightly. "Don't," I said quietly, steady enough that she stopped mid-sentence. "Tonight isn't about excuses. Tonight is about honesty. You've been keeping secrets. I just decided not to be the last one to know." Her face went pale, the same way it had when she realized I wasn't reacting with blind joy at her surprise. She glanced around the restaurant, embarrassed, but no one was watching us closely enough. The corner booth had been her choice. She thought it would shield her announcement, but now it shielded the truth. "I thought," she faltered, fumbling with the papers. "I thought I could protect you." That line nearly made me laugh. Protect me? By lying? By sneaking behind my back? But I didn't laugh, because I didn't want her to mistake this for a game. Protect me from what? Reality? Or from the fact that this child isn't mine? The word child seemed to echo, though I said it low. She pressed her lips tight, as if even forming an answer would cost her something irreversible. When she stayed silent, I leaned back and folded my arms. "You wanted to make me part of a story I never agreed to. You planned it down to the prenatal vitamins and the ultrasound photo. But you forgot one thing. I pay attention. She shook her head, tears forming now. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. I wanted to tell you. You wanted control, I corrected. You wanted to choose when and how I'd hear it, so you could script my reaction. But Madison, real life doesn't follow your script. I write my own lines. The waiter returned just then, oblivious, setting plates of steaming pasta in front of us. Madison kept her head down, tears falling onto her napkin. I thanked the waiter, smiling politely as though nothing was wrong. When he left, I twirled a forkful of pasta, the steam curling up into my face, and said, "Eat. You'll need your strength." She looked up at me, startled. "For what?" "For the conversation we're going to have when we get home," I said evenly. "And don't worry, I won't shout. I won't humiliate you. But we're going to talk, and then we're going to decide what happens next, together or apart." Her tears spilled faster, but I didn't flinch. I wanted her to understand. This wasn't rage, it was resolve. Revenge didn't have to be loud to leave a mark. Sometimes the sharpest cut is silence filled with evidence. We finished dinner quietly. I ate enough to make it look normal. She pushed her food around, appetite gone. When the check came, I paid without hesitation. On the walk to the car, she tried to take my hand. I slipped it into my pocket. The drive home was silent except for the hum of tires on pavement. She stared out the window, the city lights reflecting in her eyes. I focused on the road, calm as ever, though my heart hammered like it wanted out of my chest. At home, she finally broke. As soon as the door closed, she turned to me, voice trembling. "Please, let me explain." I set the folder on the kitchen counter and crossed my arms. "Then explain. No more half-truths. No more strategies. Just the truth. Right now." And she began to talk. About late nights at work that weren't really about work. About how someone else filled the gaps when our marriage felt like it was sinking. About fear, about mistakes, about choices she couldn't undo. The words spilled out, messy, raw, stripped of the careful control she usually kept. I didn't interrupt. I let her say every word. Because in that moment, the silence was my revenge. She had to live inside her own confession, with no script to rescue her. When she finished, I nodded slowly, still calm. "Thank you for finally telling the truth. But Madison..." I picked up the folder, tapped it lightly and added, "I already knew." Her knees buckled as she sank into a chair, face pale, shoulders trembling. She realized then what she hadn't before. The damage wasn't in me yelling or throwing accusations. The damage was in me being prepared, steady, impossible to manipulate. And that was just the beginning. The house had never felt so quiet. Even the clock in the living room seemed to tick slower, like it didn't want to intrude. Madison sat at the kitchen table, face pale, shoulders slumped, while I stood by the counter with the folder closed at my side. For years, this had been our home, the place of Saturday pancakes, movie nights, and late summer barbecues. Now it felt like a stage, stripped of scenery, where two actors stood at the end of a play with no lines left. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Don't leave me." I studied her carefully. "Madison, you already left me. You just forgot to move out." Her eyes filled again, but I didn't let her tears guide me. For months, I had been the one in pain, lying awake, wondering why the woman I loved had built walls I couldn't climb. Tonight, the walls had collapsed, and she was standing in the rubble. "This isn't revenge for me," I said, sliding the folder across the counter toward her. "This is clarity. Everything in there is the truth you tried to bury. I wanted you to face it because I refused to live in a house built on lies." She shook her head, fingers digging into her napkin. "It was a mistake. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I thought I could control it. Fix it before it hurt you." "Control," I repeated softly. "That's the word, isn't it? You controlled intimacy. You controlled the timing. You controlled when I was allowed to know. You didn't want a partner. You wanted a shadow to applaud when you revealed your surprise." Her hands covered her face and her voice came muffled. "I was scared of losing everything. And yet," I said, calm as stone, You've already lost the one thing that mattered most, my trust. We sat in silence for what felt like an hour, but was only minutes. Finally, I straightened, my decision carved clear in my chest. I've spoken to an attorney. We'll divide things fairly. I'm not here to punish you, Madison. I'm here to take my life back. Her head snapped up, panic flashing in her eyes. You can't mean divorce. Please, not after everything. After everything, I echoed. That's exactly why. I deserve a life with honesty. You deserve to live with the choices you made. I can't give you forgiveness as a shortcut. You'll have to find that on your own. The words landed like stones in still water, rippling out. She reached across the table, desperate, but I stepped back. No anger, no shouting, just distance that spoke louder than rage. Over the next week, the process began. We sat with papers, dividing accounts, listing property. The house went on the market. Friends whispered when they heard. Some taking her side, others mine. I let them whisper. I had nothing left to defend. My truth was solid. On the final day before I moved out, I stood in the empty living room, sunlight streaming through bare windows. Madison lingered by the door, eyes red, a shadow of the woman I once knew. She opened her mouth, but no words came. I carried the last box to my car, shut the trunk, and looked at her one last time. Goodbye, Madison, I said, not unkindly, and then I left. Driving away, I felt a strange mix of sorrow and relief. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't destroyed anything. I hadn't stooped to anger. My revenge had been quieter, sharper, forcing her to see the truth she thought she could hide, and walking away with my dignity intact. Sometimes revenge isn't about destroying the other person. Sometimes it's about showing them you cannot be broken by their betrayal. And as I drove into a future that was finally mine again, I realized the greatest revenge was not the folder of evidence or the pale look on her face. It was the peace I carried with me, a peace she could no longer touch. Because the story she tried to write for me was over, and I was free to begin a new one.